A warm welcome to today's video. This is about direct realism, specifically for A-level philosophy. Now, direct realism is part of a unit called perception. And perception is all about how we perceive the external world. Okay. Now, direct realism is a very, very simple theory. Even if you have not studied it, you understand it. And that's because this is the common sense view of perception. Okay. There's a physical world, it exists, we perceive it directly, there's no barrier, there's no intermediary, we just see things and that's what's actually there. The diagram demonstrates this. You can diagram during a response in an exam. You don't have to, but it's one way of doing it. This is really a very, very simple theory. The challenge with this theory actually comes when writing about it. Because it's very simple, there's not much to say, and often students who I've worked with and students like myself, I've done the exams recently, I got the top marks. The key to this is understanding how to write enough about direct realism. And my first tip for this is using the exam board. Now, I always recommend that for the best responses, you just mirror back to the exam board. In this case, it's AQA. You just mirror back to AQA what they think and what they are defining the theory to be. So direct realism is defined as the immediate objects of perception are mind-independent objects. That's it. That's simple. And so whether you have a 3-mark, a 5-mark, a 12-mark, a 25-mark essay, for all of those responses, you need to write this sentence. It's only a few words, it's easy to memorize, it's easy to understand. You don't need to think about or worry about being too technical. There's a good amount of technicality in there. That's the perfect first sentence for any question on direct realism. And the issues that the exam board want you to know about are these 4. We're going to cover those 4 in today's video, but before we do, we need to explore some additional things that we can discuss about direct realism. So this is the common sense view of perception, and what that means is the exam board do not credit a specific philosopher with the theory. So it's not direct realism, Hume's theory of perception, Locke's theory of perception, Berkeley's theory. It's no one's theory of perception. Specifically, it's just the common sense view. Now, this theory posits that the mind-independent world exists, obviously. Well, I say obviously, that's not so obvious when we go on and cover later videos. If you find this video helpful at any point, please give it a like, please subscribe, because there will be more and more videos coming out in the coming weeks. There may be, when you're watching this, on all aspects of the A-level philosophy course, both on content and technique, how to get the top marks for philosophy A-level. I digress though. The next point is we perceive mind-independent objects and their properties. Okay, this is very similar to what the exam board say. When writing a good response, it's very important that you use different words and phrases for the same thing. And what I mean by that is instead of just repeating mind-independent objects, you can instead use the phrase physical objects or the external world, for example. Now, this is true across all parts of the course. You need to be articulate and you need to be academic. It's not going to be the difference between you getting an E and an A, but it will elevate your response. You're trying to convince the examiner. That's the whole point. You need to convince the examiner that you're a top student capable of getting the top marks. And one important way of doing that is to have an academic register. So you need to use different phrases. Don't just repeat yourself. Okay? These are the additional things. There are 4 points here. These could be a sentence in a 5-mark response, as well as the first point, in Direct Realism. We're now going to cover the criticisms, though. The first one is the issue of illusions and hallucinations. Now, when planning this video, when writing this presentation, I was thinking about having illusion and hallucination as separate points. Okay, I have not made them separate points for now. The exam will define them as separate points. So absolutely, you can do these as separate points. In an essay, for example, these can be 2 separate paragraphs. Or in a 12-mark question, when asked to discuss 2 different criticisms, you could do hallucination and you can do illusion as separate. That's absolutely fine. The reason I do these same criticism is because the point they're hitting on, the key detail, in my opinion, is very, very similar. And so you'll get more of a breadth of response if you write about non-veridical perceptions as one point, perceptual variation as another point, and time lag as your third point. Another key revision tip is that when you're doing revision, you always want to be evaluating. That's for 2 reasons. First of all, it's good in and of itself because it's a high value task in the order of learning. If you don't know the order of learning, I'd suggest you look that up. Of all the tasks you can be doing for learning, evaluation is very high because you're having to consider and think about pros and cons of different ideas. You're connecting theories well. So evaluation is just good in and of itself. This is my first point because this is the best criticism, in my view. The second reason we want to evaluate is because this is directly how we, pardon the pun, this is directly how we would write in an essay. Our 25-mark essays in philosophy, the bulk of our marks, 20 of our 25 marks, are evaluation marks. By already evaluating when revising, you've got your 3 points, so you're not stressing about planning. When you get a question on direct realism, you know your 3 points well, but you also know how strong each of them are relative to the other ones. You know which one's going to be your first paragraph, you know which one's going to be your strongest paragraph. So 2 reasons there to always evaluate. Now, I've used some technical language, non-veridical perception. That's just saying inaccurate perceptions that aren't really there. Okay, false perceptions. You can look up the definition if you would like. You can use language like this, as I've talked about before, to sound more academic. It's not essential, but it is a good to have. I wouldn't worry about this if you're watching this video to remind yourself of what direct realism is because you've forgotten, then this is non-veridical perception is not the most important thing. Just getting your mind back into understanding the criticisms and the theory is more important. But if you're looking for study tips to get the top marks, non-veridical perception is there for you. Now, I've used standard forms. You're welcome to use standard forms. You can copy this one. This isn't mine. I've just got this off the internet. Standard forms are a really great thing to use in essays. They're not the only way you need to respond in essays. You're absolutely fine if you just do a sentence and then analyze and evaluate it as you go. It doesn't really matter. Here's the standard form. Now, I'm not going to read this out to you. The key point with non-veridical perceptions is this. I need to get my notes so I clearly articulate this for you. Okay, so in the hallucinations, your experience of the world is not caused by the world. When Macbeth sees the dagger, a common analogy used by the exam board, when Macbeth sees the dagger is not in the world. And so it's not even a case of this being a direct experience of the world, a direct sense experience. It's not caused by the world at all. Okay? And the idea is similar with illusion. What is being sensed, what is being experienced of the world is not part of the world. And so not only does this highlight a difference between our sense experience and the world itself, it shows that direct realism is insufficient, it's incomplete, because there is no explanation for hallucinations and for illusions, because they're not caused by the world. Hallucinations is the strongest of the 2 points, I would say, because illusions are still sometimes caused, if you think of a stick in water, that is caused by the external world. But a hallucination is completely mind dependent. Okay, so that's hallucination. Now, for each of these criticisms, I have put a response. There are a few ways of responding to this. One way is sort of to deny hallucinations as a convincing experience of reality. So you say, well, Macbeth knows that the dagger isn't in the world. And because he knows that it's not in the world, he knows it's not a trustworthy and true perception. And so you can dismiss it. Or you say, well, yeah, direct realism is insufficient because there is an experience. So you sort of concede, you say that's a good criticism, and then that leads you to talk about indirect realism. So that's one way. If you are not convinced by this and you want articulation, there are resources below where you can look for even more stronger responses. I have not covered those because it is getting into the weeds. I wanted to cover the broader theory. Please leave in the comments if you would like a full video on the best responses. I'd be absolutely willing to do that. Our next criticism is perceptual variation. Now, this is Russell articulated this analogy of a desk. Locke and Hume and Berkeley also talked about lots of these ideas. So Berkeley specifically talked about hallucinations. Hume and Locke have also talked about both these ideas. But Russell I'm going to credit with the analogy where he talks about a desk. So again, there's the standard form. This is one I've written. This is not one I've got off the internet, so it's not very good. You're welcome to copy this, copy another one, memorize it, and just blurt it down in an exam. That's one way of doing it. Make sure you use something like the Feynman technique to make sure you understand perceptual variation. Now, the key issue with perceptual variation is that if we do not experience objects exactly as they are, think about an idea like texture. We feel a desk to be smooth. We look under a microscope and feel that it's actually incredibly rough and textured. If we do not experience the world directly, then there appears to be a gap between objects and our perception of them. And if there's this gap between objects, the external world, and our perception of them, then direct realism is not accurate. Because direct realism claims that there is no gap between our direct experience, our experiences directly of the world. And so perceptual variation can show that there is a gap between our perception and the external world. Now, what this leads some philosophers, Russell, Locke, Hume, to talk about is sense data. So you can also lead this through to indirect realism and say, well, the explanation for this is there's an intermediary called sense data. This is representative realism or indirect realism. The responses to this one are slightly stronger. Okay, I've got this one below. Common sense realism. So you respond that, yeah, well, the perspective of the agent does change. But because the perspective of the agent changes, the conditions of the external world change. And so we have a thing called relational properties and intrinsic properties. And the relational properties, such as the light, which causes the desk to appear differently, of course that's going to change our perception. Okay? So even though we do not perceive the world exactly right, we don't perceive the world precisely, we do perceive the world directly. Okay? That's the response to the issue of perceptual variation. That is for you to evaluate. Do you think the response is strong enough? Finally, we have time lag. Okay? So this can be explained very easily. When we look up at the sun, what we are seeing is not the sun as it currently is. We're seeing the sun of a few minutes ago. I think it's 7, maybe 8 minutes ago, because of the time it takes a light to travel. The reason this is a problem is because it means we're not directly perceiving the world. We're perceiving the world as it was. We're perceiving the world in the past. If it takes a small instant for light to travel to us. And so if the sun were to explode, we would not know for 7 or 8 minutes until after it happened. Pretty basic criticism, pretty basic response. Now, my critique of this is that it misunderstands terms. And so the problem is that it misunderstands the term directly with the term immediately. So again, common sense view. Well, of course we don't experience things instantaneously, because of course it takes sound waves and light waves time to travel, of course. But just because we don't experience things immediately, that doesn't mean we don't perceive them directly. We do perceive things directly, because directly does not mean immediately. The direct realist was never saying we experience the world instantaneously. The direct realist was never denying that it takes time for waves to travel through the air. What they were saying is that there is no barrier. There's no sense data. When we look up at the sun, we are looking up at the actual sun which exists in the world. And that there's no sense data. There's the sun and we look at it and we see it. After the 7 minutes for time to travel, we will see the exploding sun. I don't know what on earth that would look like. So you can be quite nuanced and you can just define terms and you can get past time lag, in my opinion, quite easily. That is the basic idea with direct realism, okay? If, as I said, this video has been helpful, good. Test yourself now. Don't just let this knowledge sit. Test yourself, write questions, use questions online. Thank you for watching.